Hi Year 10, welcome to Biomes Lesson 9. Today we'll be looking at resilience and whether or not the Great Barrier Reef is resilient to change. Before we get into some definitions, it's important to remember that all ecosystems, including the Great Barrier Reef, exist in a state of what we call dynamic equilibrium, which means a situation in which stability is achieved in an ecosystem. We like balance. However, there are things that make an ecosystem vulnerable to change. These might be natural stress or human-induced stress. And the level of vulnerability depends on a variety of factors, such as how diverse the ecosystem is, the location, how old the ecosystem is, etc. All of these factors can put an ecosystem at risk. What we want to know, though, is how resilient or how able to overcome these risks an ecosystem is. So, resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to maintain key functions and processes in the face of stress or pressure, which can be either natural or human-induced. As mentioned before, the greater degree of biodiversity that there is in an ecosystem, the greater resilience the ecosystem has. The more species are available, the more able an ecosystem is to regenerate and adapt, which makes it less vulnerable. Being resilient is all about being less vulnerable to these stresses that are outside of the reef's control. They cannot control natural stress, they cannot control human-induced stress, so they need to be able to grow resilience and be resilient to these changes. As part of being resilient, some ecosystems are able to harness these natural stresses and turn them into an important part of their functioning. For example, there are some ecosystems that require bushfires to come through to regenerate seed pods, enable for them to be able to germinate. So this is an act of resilience in the face of a natural stress. On this slide are some resilience buzz terms. These are words you can integrate into your response and able to show some deeper understanding of what resilience actually means. The three terms we're going to look at are elasticity, malleability, and amplitude. Elasticity is all about the rate of recovery of an ecosystem after stress. It's the ecosystem's ability to bounce back or be elastic after a stressful event has occurred. Malleability is all about the difference between the final recovery level of the ecosystem and the pre-stress level of the ecosystem. How much change, how much different is the ecosystem after a stressful event? The greater the difference, the greater the malleability, the less the ecosystem is resilient. Amplitude is the maximum level of strain an ecosystem can bear before it becomes impossible for it to recover. So you might want to consider what the amplitude is in relation to the Great Barrier Reef and coral bleaching events. How many of these coral bleaching events can it take before it becomes impossible for the reef to recover? So let's talk about resilience specifically on the Great Barrier Reef. The first question is the Great Barrier Reef resilient? And the answer to that is yes. The Great Barrier Reef has evolved over thousands and thousands of years, and it is highly resilient to change. It has been able to manage changes over this time period and still exists today. There are many examples of resilience on the reef, and we're going to cover a few now. The first example of resilience is against tropical cyclones. Tropical cyclones cause extensive damage to the reef. They damage the structure of the reef and the coral of the reef through strong wind and waves. However, the reef has actually co-evolved with tropical cyclones to use them to their benefit. Not only do cyclones bring cool water from deeper parts of the ocean to help cool the reef against coral bleaching, but it also is able to use cyclones to transport healthy corals to parts of the reef that may have been previously damaged. The wind and wave action collect healthy corals in part of its destructive path and actually deposit those corals into other parts of the reef for them to grow in a transplant sort of an action. The reef has been recovering from cyclones for centuries, thus showing it is resilient to this form of natural stress. The Great Barrier Reef structure also makes it resilient to change. The Great Barrier Reef isn't just one single reef form. It's made up of a combined 3,800 individual reefs. This means that if one reef is damaged, there are many other reefs that are still able to function. When one part of the reef is damaged, it's supported by an influx of coral from healthier parts of the reef, which helps to regenerate and heal the area that has been damaged. If the Great Barrier Reef was just one continuous structure, this wouldn't be able to occur. Therefore, the structure of the reef itself is an aspect of its resilience. The reef has experienced a number of mass bleaching events, particularly in 2016 and 2017. However, research found that less coral was destroyed in 2017 than in the 2016 mass bleaching event. despite the conditions being much worse in 2017. This can be attributed to the fact that some of the coral have been able to acclimatise better due to its previous experience with high temperatures, making the reef more resilient. The final aspect of resilience we're going to look at is around biodiversity. The reef is incredibly biodiverse, with thousands of species of fish and coral and other marine creatures calling the reef home. This makes it able to be resilient or bounce back from one species being removed or one species being introduced, because there are other species there to take their place in the food chain or become a predator to it. High levels of biodiversity make ecosystems more resilient to change, so if we were to lose those levels of biodiversity on the reef, it will become more vulnerable. I have one question to answer today, and the key term for that question is examine. Examine is a fairly broad key term, and NESA defines it as inquiring into, so it gives you a lot of scope for what you include in your answer. What we want you to do when you examine a topic is look in close detail. This means not just describing an issue or what's happening, but delving deeper and looking at some of the impacts that are occurring because of that issue. For the Great Barrier Reef, you'll need to be able to give detailed information, such as statistics, about the topic of resilience. There are a number of useful links on Schoolbox to get you started, but you also need to do some of your own research to give examples of the Great Barrier Reef being resilient. So, your question for today is question 23 on your Biomes worksheet. This is an 8-mark question and requires you to complete 22 lines of written response. Please make sure you adhere to the suggested line count, or I may ask you to resubmit before sending you the sample answers. Once you have completed your question, please submit done on Schoolbox so I know that you're ready for me to check your work. Once I've deemed that you've met the requirements, I will send you the sample answers for you to mark your answer. You then have the rest of this lesson to work on your case study. Please make sure you're not neglecting your case study, as it definitely will be assessed in your assessment in week 9. Thanks for your 10. I'll see you next lesson.